My name is Maddie Harris. I'm 38 years old, and all my life I was treated as the invisible one the daughter asked to fetch to serve to disappear so my brother could shine. I told myself I could endure it. But on New Year's Eve, in the most glittering restaurant in Boston, my father's voice cut through the laughter and reduced me to nothing more than a servant. That night, while glasses clinked and everyone mocked me, they had no idea the empire behind those very walls carried my name, and the truth waiting to break would silence the room forever. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The dining room sparkled with gold lights strung across polished wood beams. Waiters glided between tables, their trays balanced with champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres. Outside, snow fell in thin sheets, the kind that coated the city in glitter under the street lamps. Inside, warmth and laughter buzzed in the air, rising higher with every tick toward midnight. My family occupied a long table near the center, the kind reserved for VIP guests. My father, Richard Harris, 66, sat straight-backed at the head. Even retired, he carried the authority of a courtroom, every movement crisp, every word edged with command. Beside him was my mother, Evelyn, 63, her pearls gleaming under the chandelier. She leaned eagerly toward David and Karen Whitman, longtime family friends and business investors, recounting story after story about my brother. Christopher, or Chris as everyone called him, was 40 and the star of the evening. His suit was sharp, his hair perfectly styled, his laugh rehearsed. People listened when he spoke, and my parents glowed in his presence. The moment I stepped up to the table, my father didn't bother with a hello. His voice sliced through the chatter. "Maddie, get us a few more glasses, will you? Don't just stand there." Heat rose in my chest, but I kept my face still. The Whitmans looked at me briefly, then looked away the way someone glances at staff in a hotel lobby. I reached for the nearest tray of glasses without protest. I balanced the weight in my hands, feeling the familiar strain in my arms. To anyone else, I might have looked like one of the waitresses weaving between tables, except the name on the reservation wasn't theirs. It was ours. Yet here I was, cast as the help. My voice slipped into the silence of my mind, the only place I could tell the truth. I've grown used to it, I thought, being the extra pair of hands, the background noise, the servant in my own family. I set the glasses carefully at the table. My mother's eyes brushed over me without recognition, her lips curving in a smile meant for Karen Whitman, as she said, "Chris has always had that drive, that spark. We're so proud of him." Chris chuckled, shaking his head modestly. "Oh, Mom." The Whitmans laughed with him, their champagne flutes catching the light. My father reached across the table and clapped Chris's shoulder, his voice booming over the clinking glasses. "This," he said proudly, "this right here is the true pride of the Harris family." The words dropped like stones, heavy and deliberate. A ripple of laughter rolled across the table, polite but strong enough to sting. My mother's eyes gleamed. Chris's smile widened, and the guests nodded as though my father had just pronounced an unshakable truth. And me? I stood there with an empty tray in my hands, invisible, as if the very role I'd been given all my life had followed me here, into this shining room, into this new year that hadn't even begun. I swallowed hard, forcing the familiar ache back down. Around us, the restaurant buzzed. Waiters moved quickly, glasses filled and emptied, the city outside pulsed with the promise of midnight. But at our table, time felt slower, thicker, like the air had been claimed by one voice, one name, one golden sun. My father kept his hand firmly on Chris's shoulder, holding it there like a claim of ownership, his smile bright with pride. The Whitmans leaned in closer, eager for more. My mother dabbed at the corner of her eye as if she might cry from happiness. I shifted the tray against my hip, waiting for someone, anyone, to look at me. No one did. The laughter swelled again, filling the space where my own voice should have lived. And I stood quietly watching, carrying the weight the same way I always had. The countdown clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight. 11 o'clock sharp. The night stretched ahead, long and glittering with hours still to endure. And I already knew. It would be a night my family would never forget. The air that night was so sharp it burned my lungs when I ran up the front steps. I remember my hands aching from the cold, the envelope clutched so tight it bent under my grip. The words Boston University were stamped across the top in bold blue, and for 23 years of my life I'd never carried anything that felt so heavy with promise. Snow clung to my hair and the hem of my coat as I shoved open the door, heart pounding, ready to finally be seen. The living room was bursting with people. Jackets draped over every chair, voices layered on top of each other until it was nothing but noise. The television blared highlights of Chris's last basketball game, his face glowing on the screen as if he owned the entire state of Massachusetts. Friends of my parents crowded around him, glasses raised, laughter spilling into every corner of the house. I stepped inside the letter, trembling in my hand. I got it, I whispered, my voice lost in the roar of celebration. No one turned. Chris stood in the center of the room, tall, confident, soaking in the spotlight. A gold medal from the regional finals dangled around his neck, flashing every time he moved. My father beamed beside him, his hand resting proudly on Chris's back like a trophy. "This is the kind of achievement that makes a name last," he declared, his voice booming over the room. I lifted the envelope higher, trying again. "Dad, The sound of champagne corks popping drowned me out. Someone shouted, "To Chris Harris!" The Pride of Boston glasses clinked. Cheers erupted. My father lifted his own high above his head. "To my son, the one who will carry our family's name forward. The Harris name will live because of him." The words landed like a slap. My throat closed, but I forced myself to step closer. I held the letter out, my fingers numb. I was accepted. Full scholarship. Boston University wants me. My mother brushed past, carrying a tray piled with nachos and chicken wings, her eyes locked on Chris. "Eat up, sweetheart. You'll need your strength for the next game." She didn't even glance at me. I froze in the middle of the room, the paper trembling as though it carried the weight of my entire existence. The crowd surged toward Chris, shaking his hand, pounding his back, showering him with praise. "Boston's finest," someone said. "Future NBA star," another laughed. "He's destined," my father boasted. My voice slipped out one last time, small and broken. I got in. No one heard. The room spun with celebration confetti tossed from nowhere, beer spilling on the carpet. My brother's grin stretching wide as though the world belonged to him. And maybe it did. In that house, it certainly wasn't mine. I lowered the envelope, folding it against my chest. The edges cut into my skin, reminding me it was real, even if no one cared. I wanted to scream, to shake someone, to force them to see me. Instead, I stood still, silent, while the cheers rose around me. My father's voice rose above it all, the sound of a gavel striking. "Chris is the Harris legacy. He will put this family on the map." The room erupted again. Glasses slammed together, the sound like thunder. I slipped down the hallway, unnoticed, the envelope pressed tight against me. Upstairs in my room, the noise faded to a dull roar through the floorboards. I sat at my desk. The scholarship letter spread open before me, black ink against crisp white. Words like "congratulations," "full academic award," "honor" stared up at me, proof that I had earned something of my own. I stared until the letters blurred. Then with careful fingers I folded it once, twice, slid it into the drawer of my desk, and closed it softly. That was the first time I learned my victories meant nothing here. The first time I understood that in my family's story I wasn't written in bold. I was a footnote hidden in the margins, easily ignored. Downstairs, the crowd roared as Chris retold his winning shot, and the house shook with pride that didn't belong to me. I sat in the dark, staring at the closed drawer, my hands still tingling from the cold, my chest hollow. It was the moment I realized I would never be heard in that house, no matter how loudly I tried. The tray felt heavier every time I carried it back to the table. My father barely looked at me as he waved a hand in my direction. "Maddie, pour Mr. Whitman another glass. And bring more napkins. These are running low." I moved quickly, the sound of my heels muffled by the thick carpet. The restaurant's dining hall glowed with soft golden light music drifting faintly from the bar where a jazz trio played. To anyone else, it looked like a perfect New Year's Eve celebration. To me, it felt like the same script I had been cast in since childhood. Silent, obedient, unseen. Karen Whitman glanced at me as I leaned over to pour her wine. Her smile was polite, but her voice had that tone the one people use with waitstaff. "Miss, could you top mine off as well?" The word miss stung more than it should have. I wasn't a stranger passing through their night. I was part of this family. But the way she said it, casual, dismissive, carved me right out of my own bloodline. I filled her glass carefully, steadying my hand, even though my chest ached. Rachel, seated next to Chris in her crimson dress, leaned into him and smirked in my direction. "At least she's useful tonight," she said, her laugh too sharp to be mistaken for humor. Heat spread up my neck. I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek, gripping the tray until my knuckles whitened. My eyes burned, but I forced them dry. I moved back toward the buffet, my shoulders tight. In my head, the words rose like a whisper I couldn't let out. 38 years old, and I was still treated like the family's shadow. Chris raised his glass, oblivious or maybe willfully blind. "To new beginnings," he said loudly, and the table erupted in applause. My father smiled with pride. My mother dabbed the corner of her eye, glowing as though her son had already conquered the year ahead. I slipped behind them, stacking empty plates, silent as ever. The laughter roared over me, smothering the sound of my breath. I wanted to shout that I wasn't invisible, that I had built something they couldn't even dream of. But instead, I carried dishes. As I turned, a flicker of movement caught my eye. At the far end of the room, Nancy Brown sat with her phone resting casually in her lap. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't clapping. Her sharp eyes tracked every exchange, every order tossed my way, every insult that slid between the cracks of laughter. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, the kind that told me she had already decided how this story would be told in her next blog post. I knew Nancy. She collected details like pearls, strung them into tales for an audience, hungry for gossip. I held her gaze for a heartbeat, the clatter of forks and glasses filling the silence between us. For a moment, it felt like she saw through the performance, through the mask, to the tension coiled inside me. Then she looked down at her screen thumbs, moving quickly. My chest tightened. She was already writing. I set the tray back on the sideboard, the metal cool against my palms. The room buzzed louder. Glasses raised laughter, circling like smoke. My father's voice boomed again, praising Chris's natural leadership. Rachel's laughter rang like a bell, sharp and deliberate. And I stood there, hands empty, surrounded by noise that didn't belong to me, waiting for the night to tip from humiliation into something else. The clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight. I swallowed the ache in my throat and steadied myself. Somewhere in the crowd, Nancy Brown kept watching. I moved in and out of the dining room with another tray balanced on my hands, the heat from the food seeping through the linen napkin beneath it. My arms ached, but I kept my steps even careful, as though the entire party would collapse if I spilled a single drop. At the table, Chris was in the middle of one of his stories, his voice carrying easily over the clink of silverware. He leaned back in his chair, a grin stretched across his face. "The project in Cambridge didn't quite pan out," he admitted, laughing as though failure was just another badge of honor. "But you know how it is with real estate. Timing is everything. The next one is going to be the one." My father nodded, his hand gripping the stem of his wineglass like a judge's gavel. "That's persistence. That's what makes a man successful. He never quits." The Whitmans chuckled, lifting their glasses in polite agreement. My mother's eyes gleamed as if Chris had just announced a Nobel Prize. I slid the tray onto the buffet and began distributing plates. The smell of roasted lamb, garlic potatoes, and glazed carrots clung to me, the steam rising into my face as I leaned in between chairs. No one made room. No one said thank you. I was another shadow in the room, invisible but useful. Inside a different story lived. I thought back to the spring of 2012 when I stood in a rented kitchen in Queens with sweat dripping down my back, the air thick with the scent of frying onions and fresh bread. The ovens groaned, the burners hissed, and I stirred pots until my arms shook. That was the night the first Harbor Dine location opened a small corner restaurant with borrowed money and borrowed courage. I had signed those loan papers with trembling hands, praying the bank wouldn't laugh in my face. The memory sharpened, my signature at the bottom of those pages, the weight of the pen in my hand, the look of doubt in the loan officer's eyes, then the way the line of customers stretched out the door by the end of the first week. Years blurred together, 12-hour shifts burned fingers, the scrape of chairs against tile as the dinner rush never seemed to end. Stacks of invoices piled high on my desk, the constant ringing of the phone, the back and forth with suppliers who tested my patience. But I grew it. One location turned to 3 to 7, and by the time 2020 arrived, Harbor Dine had 15 restaurants across New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. I remembered the firm handshake of my first investor, the click of a champagne glass in a quiet deal room, the sense of standing taller than I ever had at home. I looked around the table now, and heard the laughter ripple as Chris retold another story, this one about a promising development that collapsed before it even broke ground. They laughed with him, not at him, the way families laugh at the antics of their golden child. My father lifted his glass again, pride rolling off him like heat from a furnace. Not one of them could imagine that while they poured their admiration into Chris, I was building something none of them could touch. The vibration in my pocket pulled me back to the present. I slipped a hand inside my coat, my fingers brushing against my phone. The screen glowed with a message from Samantha Lee, my attorney and closest confidant. Deal closed, San Francisco, 150 NEMSers secured. For a moment, the voices at the table blurred into nothing. The clatter of forks, the laughter, the booming praise of my father. All of it fell away. All I saw were those words, simple and final, glowing against the dark screen. I pressed the phone tight against my palm, my pulse racing. 15 years of work of sweat, of humiliation swallowed in silence. And now another deal that proved what I had built wasn't an accident. It was an empire. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, forcing my expression calm. My father laughed loudly at something Chris said, his hand slapping the table, his pride spilling into every corner of the room. My mother leaned forward, her pearls catching the light, her eyes shining as if Chris's every word was scripture. The Whitmans smiled politely. Rachel giggled at Chris's shoulder, and I kept moving, setting plates, pouring wine, clearing glasses. No one noticed the slight curve of my mouth, the trace of a smile I couldn't quite bury, because while they thought I was nothing more than the family's servant, the truth rested quietly in my pocket, pulsing with every heartbeat. And I knew it was only a matter of time before they learned who I really was. The stainless steel counter was slick with condensation, and I wiped the tray slowly, more for something to do with my hands than because it needed polishing. The clatter of voices from the dining room bled faintly through the swinging doors. I heard my father's laugh booming and full echoing down the hallway like a reminder that no matter where I went in that building, I couldn't escape his presence. The door swung open with a soft creak, and Michael stepped inside. He balanced a stack of empty plates in his arms, setting them gently onto the counter. His tie was already loosened, his dark hair falling across his forehead, and for once he didn't carry that practiced neutral expression he always wore at family gatherings. He hesitated a moment before speaking. "You don't deserve this," he said quietly, almost as if he was afraid the walls might repeat his words back to our father. I let out a short laugh, dry as the towel in my hands. Chris is their pride, their golden child. You know that as well as I do. Michael shook his head, leaning against the counter, his arms crossed now as he studied me. That's not what I'm saying. I mean, you don't bend the way they think you do. I've watched you. You're stronger than they'll ever admit. The words landed heavier than I expected. I kept my gaze on the tray, my cloth circling its rim as if perfect shine would make sense of years of silence. My chest tightened, the weight of all the things I wanted to tell him pressing at my throat. "If only you knew," I whispered to myself, the sound barely escaping. Michael tilted his head, catching it, knew what I looked up, and his eyes met mine, steady and searching. They were the same shade of blue as mine, though his carried a gentleness I had long lost. "If you only knew what I've built," I said, my voice steadier this time, though my lips twisted into a wry smile. "If you knew the life I've carved outside these walls, the things they'll never acknowledge." Michael stepped closer, his voice low, urgent. "Then tell me. Because right now I see them treat you like you're nothing, and I know that's not true. I can feel it." I set the tray down, the clang sharper than I intended. My hands braced on the counter as I stared at the steel surface, my reflection blurred but present. "I've spent years hiding it," I admitted softly. "Years learning to stay quiet while they trampled me. It's easier that way. They never listen." He waited, the silence stretching until the hum of the refrigerator filled the space between us. Finally, he asked the question I'd known was coming. "What are you hiding, Maddie?" The words cracked the air like a whip. My breath caught, and for a heartbeat I considered it, telling him everything about Harbor Dine, about the deals, the empire that bore my fingerprints, though no one here knew. The truth pressed against my lips, begging for release. Instead, I forced a small smile and shook my head. "One day you'll find out," I said gently. His jaw tightened, frustration flickering across his face, but he didn't push. He just nodded once, as though promising himself he wouldn't forget this moment. Through the door came another burst of laughter, my father's voice rising proudly above the rest. Michael's eyes darted toward the noise, then back to me. "He doesn't deserve to define you," he muttered. I wanted to thank him, to tell him how much those words mattered. Instead, I picked up the tray again, holding it close to my chest. "Go back in, Michael. They'll notice you're gone." He lingered for a beat, then pushed off the counter and headed for the door. Just before it swung closed, he looked over his shoulder at me, eyes sharp, filled with questions I wasn't ready to answer. When he was gone, I exhaled slowly, the weight in my chest pressing heavier. The towel slipped from my hand onto the counter. I stared at it, then at my reflection in the steel. If only he knew the truth, I thought. If only any of them did. The sound of another round of applause rolled in from the dining room, pulling me back. I straightened, gathered the tray, and braced myself for whatever fresh humiliation awaited outside those doors. Chris rose from his chair with the confidence of a man who believed the room existed only to hear him speak. He tapped his glass lightly with a fork, and the chatter around the table stilled. The chandelier above caught the shine of his cufflinks as he spread his arms wide, commanding attention without effort. "I've been working on something big." He began, his smile. Easy, rehearsed. "A development project out in Cambridge. Not just one building. An entire chain of properties. Commercial, residential, high-end retail. The works." The Whitmans leaned forward, their polite smiles sharpening with interest. Karen tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, nodding with practiced encouragement. David folded his hands, eyes narrowing slightly in calculation. Chris continued, letting his words hang just long enough to build suspense. "And I've been in touch with the owner of this very restaurant group. We've talked about a potential partnership. Imagine, Harris Real Estate working hand in hand with Harbor Dine. A legacy in the making." The table erupted in small gasps of admiration. My father beamed, slapping the table with the flat of his palm. "Now that's vision. That's my son. Thinking like a true entrepreneur." The praise washed over Chris, and he drank it in like champagne. Rachel leaned into him, her voice dripping with pride. "He never settles for small dreams. That's what I love about him." I stood at the side of the table tray, balanced in my hands, the weight steady but heavy against my chest. My stomach clenched as I listened to him drop the words "owner of this very restaurant group," his tone casual, oblivious. He spoke of me as if I were a stranger, an abstract figure he might exploit for his next scheme. Karen Whitman turned, then her gaze falling on me with the kind of politeness that always came edged with pity. "And what about you, Maddie?" she asked lightly. "What do you do these days?" My lips parted, breath catching ready to answer with something. Anything. But before a sound escaped, my father cut in. "She keeps herself busy," he said quickly, his voice smooth, dismissive. He gestured vaguely in my direction as though explaining away a child's hobby. "Nothing serious. Nothing compared to what Chris is building." Laughter rippled down the table. Not cruel, not sharp. Worse. Polite, indulgent, the kind reserved for jokes, not worth remembering. My cheeks burned hot. I lowered my gaze to the tray, tightening my grip until the metal pressed into my palms. Inside, my thoughts seared. He has no idea, none of them do. Rachel laughed louder than the rest, tipping her head back just enough to flash the diamond on her wrist. She's good at keeping the glasses full, though she added, her voice aimed at Chris, but her eyes flicking briefly to me. The sound that followed, the mix of chuckles, the clinking of glasses, filled the space where my voice should have been. I steadied my breathing, forcing the heat in my chest to cool. I could not reveal myself here, not yet. Timing mattered. If years of silence had taught me anything, it was patience. My father lifted his glass again, his pride swelling with every word. "Chris is a true businessman, the kind of man who will carry our family name into the future." The Whitmans raised their glasses in echo, their smiles tight but obliging. The room seemed to tilt toward him, toward their golden sun, basking in the spotlight that had been built for him since birth. And me? I stood in the shadow of it all, my face calm, my hands steady, while inside a storm pressed against the edges of my silence. I turned my eyes to Chris, locking onto him across the table. He caught my gaze briefly, then looked away as though I were no more significant than the server clearing plates behind me. My voice hummed low in my mind, a truth no one else in that room knew. "You're speaking of me, Chris. You're bragging about a deal with the woman you don't even recognize." I shifted the tray against my hip, holding his image in my eyes a moment longer. He didn't see it. The irony, the danger of his words, the storm gathering just outside the walls of his pride. He laughed again, basking, and the room joined him. And I stood there, silent, knowing the joke was already his, even if he hadn't realized it yet. My father's voice cut through the laughter like a blade. "Maddie, wipe down this table. Hurry up! This family survives because of your brother. You..." His finger jabbed the air toward me. "You're fit for nothing but cleaning up after the rest of us." The words slammed into me with a force I thought I'd grown immune to, but they still found their mark. Conversations stuttered. Forks paused mid-air. A couple of the guests let out awkward chuckles, the kind that tried to smooth over the rough edge of discomfort. Others kept their eyes firmly on their plates, pretending they hadn't heard. I straightened slowly, a damp towel clutched in my hand, the fabric heavy with water. My chest burned, but I kept my face still. At the far end of the table, I caught the glint of a phone rising. Nancy Brown had it tilted at an angle, her screen glowing faint blue in the dim light. The corner of her mouth curled, not kindly but knowingly, as though she had just stumbled onto the headline she'd been waiting for all night. Her thumb hovered, then pressed, and I saw the small red dot of recording flare to life. For a moment the screen lit my face, and in that reflection I saw not just my humiliation but her satisfaction at catching it. I lifted my head, my eyes locking onto my father's. I used to let him steal my voice. I heard myself think steady and sharp inside my skull. The words rolled like thunder in my chest. But not tonight. Tonight I take it back. The table buzzed with half-hearted laughter, a release valve for the tension suffocating the air. Rachel leaned into Chris's arm, hiding a smile behind her glass of wine. My mother dabbed delicately at the corner of her mouth with her napkin, as if the cruelty in my father's words hadn't hung over us like smoke. I placed the towel down on the sideboard with care, each motion deliberate, as if slowing the world down to my pace. The sting of his words still pulsed under my skin, but behind it rose something stronger, steadier. Nancy's camera lens caught me full on now, recording the entire exchange. Her eyes flicked between her screen and me, hungry waiting. She was documenting what everyone else tried to laugh away. And in her footage, I was no longer invisible. I stepped forward and laid a fresh glass by David Whitman's elbow. My hand didn't shake. His gaze darted quickly to me, then back to my father, a nervous crease forming between his brows. Karen shifted in her seat, offering me the smallest of apologetic smiles before turning away again. My father, oblivious, raised his glass high. To Chris Harris, the man who will carry our name into the future. The chorus of voices rose weaker this time, but still enough to echo through the room. Glasses clinked. Rachel's laugh rang bright, and Chris's grin widened, like a man basking in a spotlight that had been hung just for him. I stood there, towel abandoned. My hands free, my eyes locked on the camera's glow. For the first time in my life, I didn't lower my head. The reflection of that tiny light burned across my cheek, a reminder that every word, every insult, every order had been caught. That truth was no longer confined to these walls. And with that knowledge came something I hadn't felt in years. Calm. A certainty that the balance was already shifting, that the night had begun to bend in my favor. I drew in a slow breath, lifted the tray from the counter, and turned toward the kitchen. The laughter followed me, but it no longer cut. It rang hollow, brittle, already fading behind me as the door swung shut. Inside the quiet of the back hall, I pressed my palms against the cool steel of the tray. My heart pounded steady, not frantic. For once, I wasn't trembling. The camera was still rolling behind me. The story had already begun to escape. I knew the next move was mine. I pushed through the kitchen door and slipped into the small staff lounge, tucked behind the service hallway. The fluorescent light hummed faintly overhead, the walls painted a bland beige, nothing like the glittering dining room beyond. I set the tray down on the counter, the clang louder than I intended, and pressed my palms against the cool metal surface until my breathing steadied. My sleeve slid back as I leaned forward, and the watch on my wrist caught the light. A Rolex date, just stainless steel champagne dial. I'd bought it in 2018 after signing the London contract, $50 million secured in a deal that had taken months of travel, endless meetings, and more nights awake than I could count. I remembered the way the ink bled slightly on the paper when I signed my name. My hand trembling not with fear but with exhilaration. The flashbacks came in fragments. A boardroom in Canary Wharf, the skyline of London stretching grey and glassy behind the windows. My handshake with a foreign investor firm, and final. The weight of a champagne flute in my hand as I clinked glasses with a circle of men who had underestimated me until the very last second. Their voices congratulating me, their faces forced into admiration. I had stood taller in that moment than I ever had in my father's house. I looked down at the watch now, the steady sweep of the second-hand calm against my skin. Power didn't come from applause at a dinner table. It came from building something brick by brick, even when no one believed you could. The muffled laughter from the dining room drifted through the wall, each burst a reminder of the role they had assigned me. But here in this quiet room, I felt none of their weight. Only the truth of who I was. The door opened softly and Laura Peterson stepped inside. At 42, she carried herself with the crisp composure of someone who had spent her life in the service industry, yet never let anyone mistake her for invisible. Her black suit was immaculate, her hair pinned neatly, her expression respectful, but steady. She inclined her head slightly. "Madam," she said, her voice low but firm, "the private room upstairs is ready. The 98 Bordeaux you requested has been decanted. Everything is in place." For a moment I let the word hang in the air. "Madam, not miss, not servant, madam?" I nodded, once the corners of my mouth curving just slightly. "Thank you, Laura." Her gaze flicked briefly toward the closed door leading back to the dining room where the laughter still carried. She understood more than she let on, but she didn't ask questions. She simply added, "Whenever you're ready." I straightened, smoothing my skirt, adjusting the watch back beneath my sleeve. My voice in my head steadied, calm and certain. "It's time." Laura gave a small nod and slipped out as quietly as she had come, leaving the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the room. I stood alone for a few seconds longer, letting the silence stretch, letting the tension in my body shift into something sharper. Beyond that door, my father's voice boomed. My brother laughed, my mother cooed. The Whitmans smiled, and Nancy Brown typed notes into her phone. They all thought they knew exactly who I was, but only Laura had spoken the truth aloud tonight. I picked up the tray again this time, not as a servant, but as someone carrying a secret none of them could imagine. And as I turned back toward the door, the weight in my chest no longer felt heavy. It felt like purpose. I pushed open the door with the tray balanced in my hands, the laughter spilling from the dining room wrapping around me like smoke. My father was standing again, glass lifted high, his cheeks flushed with pride. To Chris, he boomed, his voice filling every corner of the room. "The man who will take our family's name higher than it's ever been." Applause scattered around the table, polite but eager. Rachel clinked her glass against Chris's, her eyes shining as if she were sharing the throne he thought he sat on. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin as if his accomplishments were too overwhelming to contain. And then the sound shifted. A new voice, clear, deliberate, carrying across the table without strain. "Madam Harris," Laura said as she stepped into the room, her posture perfectly erect, her black suit gleaming under the chandelier. She bowed her head slightly toward me. "The private dining room and the 98 Bordeaux are ready just as you requested." Silence fell instantly. Glasses hung frozen halfway to lips. Chris's grin faltered. Rachel's fork paused mid-air. My father's head snapped toward Laura, his brows furrowing in confusion. The tray grew lighter in my hands as I walked forward and set it carefully on the sideboard. My movements were unhurried, calm, deliberate. I turned back toward the table, catching each pair of eyes as they blinked at me, wide and uncertain. My smile was small, steady, the kind that carried more weight than a raised voice. "You all heard her," I said lightly. My tone even, but cutting through the still air. "What did she just call me?" No one answered. Karen Whitman's eyes darted to her husband, then back to me, her lips parting but no words forming. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his napkin slipping from his lap. My mother's hand tightened around her wineglass until her knuckles whitened. Chris laughed nervously, the sound hollow. She must have made a mistake. Laura's expression didn't flicker. "I don't make mistakes, sir." Her voice carried authority born of years running rooms like this, but it was the conviction behind it that made the guests shift uneasily in their seats. My father's face reddened. "This is nonsense," he barked, his voice too sharp, too quick. He glanced around the table as if to pull the attention back toward him, toward the golden sun at his side. "Let's not get distracted from what matters. Tonight is about Chris." But the spell had broken. Heads turned toward me. Whispers rose like wind rushing through dry leaves. Nancy Brown's phone was angled again, her eyes locked on me, her expression almost gleeful as she recorded. I let the silence stretch, watching the unease ripple around the table. For years they had seen me as nothing. Tonight, even before I spoke another word, they were beginning to question if they had ever known me at all. I folded my hands in front of me, the Rolex hidden beneath my sleeve, but its weight grounding me. My heart beat steady, not frantic, not weak. The room had shifted. The power no longer sat at my father's end of the table or in my brother's broad smile. It was here, in the pause, in the questions, etched across their faces, in the truth that had slipped through despite their best efforts to bury me. I let my gaze travel slowly around the table, holding each set of eyes just long enough to see them falter. And then I smiled again, small and deliberate, as if I were already 10 steps ahead. The whispers grew louder, uncertainty settling over the celebration like a fog. And I knew without saying another word that the night had finally begun to turn. I stepped forward, the sound of my heels sharp against the polished floor. The guests shifted in their chairs, their eyes following me like they'd just noticed I'd been in the room all along. My father stiffened at the head of the table, his jaw locked tight. his glass still frozen halfway in the air. "This restaurant," I said, my voice steady and calm. "This chain of restaurants you're sitting in, eating, drinking, laughing in, it belongs to me. Every glass of wine, every plate of food, every polished fork was paid for by the company I built." The words dropped like stones in water. Ripples spread across the table. Gasps, whispers, uneasy glances. Chris laughed, first too loud, too forced. "That's absurd," he said, shaking his head, but his voice cracked. "You can't be serious." I met his eyes unflinching. "I've never been more serious." His smirk faltered, his confidence bleeding out of him. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Nancy Brown tilt her phone higher, the glow of her screen illuminating the stunned faces around the table. The little red light blinked, recording every second, every word. My father's face had turned a mottled red veins pressing against his temples. "Enough of this," he barked. "Sit down, Maddie, don't embarrass yourself." But the room wasn't looking at him anymore. Every gaze had swung my way, curiosity and disbelief mingling in the air. I let the silence stretch until I could hear the faint hum of the chandelier overhead, until I felt the weight of every stare pressing against me. Then, with deliberate care, I reached into my bag. The leather folder slid smoothly into my hand, its edge cool against my palm. I laid it on the table with a quiet thud that echoed louder than my father's last toast. "This," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the hush, "is something else about the man you've all been praising tonight." My fingers opened the folder and I drew out a single document, crisp and official, the notary seal catching the light. I held it up, my eyes sweeping across the room. A loan agreement, $500,000, with my signature forged at the bottom. Signed by none other than Richard Harris, your celebrated attorney, your paragon of integrity. A gasp tore through the room, sharp and collective. Karen Whitman's hand flew to her mouth. David leaned forward, squinting at the page as though the words themselves might deny what I had said. Reverend Miller lowered his gaze, mumbling a prayer under his breath. My mother's head bowed, her fingers gripping the tablecloth as though she might sink through it. She couldn't look at me, couldn't look at anyone. Chris stammered, his voice unraveling. She's lying. She has to be lying." But the paper in my hand was undeniable, the bold sweep of my father's pen, too distinct to mistake. I laid it flat on the table, sliding it forward until it rested inches from my father's untouched plate. "There it is," I said. "Black and white. The truth you've all ignored for years." The guests shifted in their chairs, the air heavy with disbelief. Some looked at my father with pity, others with a growing unease that mirrored my own calm certainty. My father's lips moved, but no sound came. His hand hovered above the document as if touching it might burn him. "Tell them it's not true," I whispered, my voice low enough for only him to hear, though the whole table leaned closer. "Tell them, Richard. Look them in the eye and say it's a lie." But he didn't. He stared at the paper, his silence speaking louder than any denial could. Around us, the room began to stir, whispers rising like a tide. Nancy's phone stayed fixed on me, her expression sharpened with the thrill of the story unraveling before her lens. I stepped back, folding my hands neatly in front of me, my head high. The air crackled with tension, the weight of secrets dragging the celebration into something else entirely. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced with the sound of doubt, of cracks forming in the mask my father had worn his whole life. And I knew as the whispers swelled that nothing in that room would ever be the same again. Chris shot up from his chair, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's making this up, all of it!" His hand slapped against the back of his chair, the sound sharp but empty. Rachel, who only moments before had been draped proudly over his arm, slipped her hand away as if his skin burned. She pushed back from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the polished floor, and took a deliberate step back. Her eyes darted toward me wide and calculating, then quickly shifted away, as though proximity to him might taint her too. The Whitmans exchanged a glance, their polished smiles collapsing into tight lines. David leaned back, folding his arms, his interest cooling into suspicion. Karen adjusted her pearls, her gaze settling on Chris with a distance that hadn't been there before. The warmth they had shown him just an hour earlier vanished, replaced by a practiced detachment of investors sensing a bad bet. Reverend Miller lowered his head, fingers interlocked tightly as if in prayer. His voice, so loud and affirming earlier in the evening, was gone. He couldn't bring himself to look at me nor at the man he had just toasted with scripture-like reverence. At the far end of the table, Michael lifted his chin. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His eyes found mine, steady, unshaken, and in the smallest motion. Just a quiet nod. He gave me what I had never had in that family recognition. It was enough to steady me, to remind me I wasn't alone in this room full of people suddenly stripped of certainty. I turned toward my father, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as if holding on for balance. His face was pale now, his earlier fire gone, but his eyes still burned with defiance. "You taught me how to clear plates," I said evenly, each word measured, deliberate. "You taught me how to wipe down tables until they shined. You told me I'd never be more than a servant in this family." I let the silence stretch, then leaned forward slightly, my voice low and unshakable. "But what you didn't know, Dad, is that one day I would own the entire restaurant." The words landed heavy. No one laughed, no one dared shift in their seats. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing down on everyone at that table. My mother's gaze dropped to her lap, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin until it shredded. The chandelier above hummed faintly, the only sound in the sudden quiet. Even the jazz trio out by the bar seemed to falter, their notes muted, as though the weight of the room had reached them too. My father's mouth opened, his throat working as if he might summon another command, another dismissal to bury me with. But nothing came. His lips trembled, his chest heaved, and then he shut his mouth again, swallowing whatever he'd tried to force out. His eyes met mine across the long table, and for the first time in my life I saw it. Fear. Not of me, perhaps, but of the truth he couldn't control anymore, a truth that no denial or booming voice could silence. The room held steady in that fragile pause the guests caught between shock and shame. The Harris family's mask finally cracked. And in that silence, I stood taller than I ever had before. I lifted my chin and turned to Laura, who had been waiting silently near the doorway. Her expression was calm, professional, but I could see the flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Make sure the staff tonight get a generous bonus," I told her. My voice carried across the room, not loud but firm enough that every guest heard. "Real work deserves real recognition." Laura inclined her head. "Of course, madam." She slipped out quietly, her presence leaving behind a ripple of unease. I turned back toward the table, my gaze settling on the man who had defined so much of my silence. My father sat rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the empty glass in front of him. I let the pause linger, then spoke clearly. "I don't need blessings from people who never once treated me as family." The words hung heavy, sharper than anything I'd said all night. My mother flinched, her napkin twisting tighter in her hands. Chris stared at me as if the ground had shifted beneath him. Rachel kept her eyes fixed on her phone, distancing herself with every heartbeat. The Whitmans leaned back in their chairs, uncomfortable, wishing they had chosen another party to attend. I took a step away from the table, then another. My heels struck the hardwood floor with a steady rhythm, each click echoing in the stunned silence. Behind me, the countdown began. 10, 9. Voices filled the restaurant, laughter and cheers bleeding in from other rooms. Fireworks cracked faintly outside, the promise of midnight drawing closer. 8, 7. The golden lights of the chandelier sparkled above, casting long shadows over the faces of people who had once laughed at me without hesitation. 6, 5. My brother shifted in his chair. His shoulders hunched. For the first time I could remember his bravado stripped away. 4, 3. My father tried to speak, his lips parting, but no sound came. His chest rose and fell too quickly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair like he might shatter them. 2, 1. I reached the doorway. Fireworks exploded outside the tall windows, bursting in gold and silver over Boston Harbor. The light filled the room brighter than the chandeliers, casting each face in stark clarity. I paused just long enough to glance over my shoulder one last time. Their expressions told the story better than I ever could. Shame, disbelief, fear, and something else they had never given me recognition. I stepped out into the lobby, the muffled roar of celebration fading behind me. The glass doors opened, and the winter air rushed in cold and sharp, carrying the scent of smoke from fireworks and the salt of the harbor breeze. Laura was waiting by the exit, coat in hand. She draped it gently over my shoulders without a word. Outside, a car idled at the curb, its headlights glowing against the snow-dusted street. I walked toward it slowly, savoring the crisp air filling my lungs. For the first time in years, I felt light, unburdened. The house of cards they had built, the illusion of their pride, had collapsed in a single night, and I hadn't needed to raise my voice to do it. The driver opened the door, and I slid into the warmth of the back seat. The city stretched before me, alive with color, fireworks blossoming against the midnight sky. My voice came softly, not for them, not for anyone else, but for me. Sometimes the sweetest revenge doesn't come with shouting. It comes with walking away in silence, and letting them see for themselves how wrong they were. The car pulled into the street, the party shrinking in the distance behind me. And to you watching this unfold, what would you have done if it were your family laughing at your expense? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have built your own empire in the shadows? Tell me what you think. Share your thoughts, your stories, because this is where we remind each other that silence can be power, and justice sometimes speaks loudest without a word. Stay with me because there are more stories of truth, family, and revenge waiting to be told.